Yeah.
Good day to everyone listening here. This is Ken. I'm pleased to be joined by two special guests here. The first one here is Arjun with Connext Network. Welcome, Arjun.
Thanks so much. Pleasure to be here.
And you might also see up here on the stage with us is Patches, one of the rocket scientists and well known in the pool community here, who will be stepping in for Joe a little bit on this call. Welcome, Patches.
Thank you. Hi, everybody.
And as you heard later on in the run up here, Mav is with us, but will be off mic for most of it as he's feeling a little under the weather. Is going to let his voice rest a little bit, but we'll save him for the bread at the end of the call here. But let's start with Connext Network. I understand that Connext is a decentralized peer-to-peer communication and payments protocol between Ethereum-compatible smart contracts and layer twos. But beyond that, I don't know much about it. So Arjun, can you start us off and maybe start a little bit just by introducing yourself and a little bit about what Connext is?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Arjun. I'm one of the founders of Connext. I've been building infrastructure in this space since 2016. I joined Ethereum or started building on top of Ethereum because I was just really interested in figuring out ways to build globally decentralized, totally sovereign public goods, like things that look like the internet, but that go beyond just simply transferring information and towards like more sophisticated mechanisms to like coordinate human beings around the world. We started Connext in 2017, so it's been about 6 years now, which is pretty awesome. It's kind of crazy to think that's been that long. Connext was one of the first like scalability infrastructure projects in this space. We were an R&D focused organization that we actually built one of the first L2s on Ethereum. It was like a scalable payment network that was integrated into MetaMask and integrated with Maker and a bunch of other things. Now, Ethereum overall obviously went in a somewhat different direction towards things like DeFi rather than payments, and the payments market actually is only just now starting to become a thing. And so in 2020, we kind of realized that there was we were seeing like scalability as a question was sort of heading in the direction of things like rollups and looking more and more like the L2 world that we see today. And so we and a lot of our friends were kind of building those L2 systems. And so we realized that there was this new problem that everybody was going to be dealing with, which was just how do you actually communicate between the L2s? So like what happens when people are using multiple different L2s? They now have to think about, okay, how do I get my RETH from Optimism to Arbitrum? Or how do I'm using an app that's on Polygon, but all of my gas money is somewhere else. Or other more like interesting complex constructions as we've started to see these days. For us, that's been like pretty much the biggest thing that we've been focused on since about 2021. We built one of the first like bridges in the space, and then since then have been like really, really focused on trying to find the right way to do cross-chain communication of all kinds in a more generalized format, especially between rollups. And the kind of quintessential challenge here is that it is really difficult to do. It is difficult in general to solve this problem, but and a lot of projects solve it by just introducing like a set of validators or a multisig or something like that between two chains. But what we've been interested in doing is figuring out how to make it possible for like a rollup to speak to another rollup, or an application on a rollup to speak to an application on another rollup in a way where you're not fundamentally taking any trade-offs in terms of security at all whatsoever. You're actually using the rollup's own security mechanism to power communication that goes between chains. And so that's something that we believe that we've cracked. We've been live with the latest iteration of our network for the better part of a year. That does enable this kind of communication across chains, and we've slowly been kind of like expanding the scale of it and working towards like now focusing on more and more use cases. One of those use cases being the topic of this space, which will be xERC20.
Yeah, so maybe that's a good segue in here. I did a little bit of research looking on the website and kind of understanding that cross-chain communication pathway. But how does it integrate with Rocket Pool? What brings you here today?
Yeah, so I think there's cross-chain stuff is obviously this like really, really big like puzzle, and token bridging is really one very small piece of it. But token bridging is also kind of like the quintessential use case, right? Like it is really like the first thing that people started doing on blockchains was sending token transfers around, and it is really the first thing that people have done across chains as well. And yet, even now, we still haven't really gotten it right. And there's a bunch of different reasons for why that's the case. So like, when you think about bridging a token, obviously everybody has like slightly different conceptions of what this means, but in order to bridge a token between chains, you need to have someone go and mint a representation of that token on another chain. So for example, let's take, Rocket Pool ETH for instance. When you take our ETH and you take it from Ethereum and you want it to be available on Optimism, you need someone to go and mint a representation of our ETH on Optimism. And right now, the canonical way to do that, the official way to do that, is to do that through the official Optimism bridge. And what happens if either no canonical bridge exists, or if that canonical bridge has, limitations? So in Optimism's case, of course, transferring that R ETH out means having to wait like a full 7 days, which is obviously like terrible user experience. Well, then as a project, you end up in one of two places. As a token issuer is kind of what we say. It's a person that's kind of creating a token that wants to be bridged across chains. So you end up basically with one of two solutions. You either go and work with existing liquidity bridges like Connext, and this is something that we've been doing for a while. You either go and work with existing liquidity bridges like Connext, and you basically have them go and build liquidity in RETH in order to make it possible to do a fast transfer of RETH from L2 to L1 and from L2 to L2. Or you go and you work with like a mint and burn bridge that goes and mints its own representation of RETH. So for example, like multi-RETH for multi-chain, or AXL RETH for Axelar, or, I guess I'm not really sure what Layer 0 calls their OFT ones, but something like that for OFTs. Now there's trade-offs to both of these approaches. So in the first case, you basically have a liquidity overhead. You have to basically, you as like Rocket Pool, or really any project, has to go and bootstrap liquidity for your token on each different bridge that you want to support it. And so not only is this like a cost to DAOs, but in addition to that, this doesn't really scale very well. So like, if you want to work towards a model where people are transferring around like very, very significant amounts of like a given token at any time, then no matter what happens, you're going to face very high slippage across chains. It also doesn't scale horizontally. So like, as we're starting to move into a world where there are now dozens of rollups, soon there will likely be hundreds. And the goal is that eventually, we want to work in this like seamless interchain world. And you can expect that like there will eventually, once we finish onboarding the world's population, be many, many thousands of rollups out there, especially, tailored to their own specific use cases and ecosystems, but there will be. And in that world, how do you, there's this enormous challenge that you then face of having to go and build RETH liquidity on each chain. And then the last kind of like trade-off there is that, slippage brings about a lot of complexity as well. So for example, if you want to build some sort of cross-chain experience that involves RETH, it becomes harder to figure out how to actually make that happen. You transfer the RETH across chains, but you don't really know how much you're going to receive on the destination, because just like a Uniswap swap, you don't actually have any way to be sure of how much slippage you're going to get when the transaction executes. But then the other model is also kind of problematic. So like, I think a lot of folks here have likely seen, what's happened in a lot of the chains that are out there that haven't had a canonical bridge. So for example, chains like Moonbeam, where they kind of decided not to go with having, at least initially when they first launched, decided to not go with having any specific bridge. And so what ended up happening inevitably was that like every single token suddenly had 6 or 7 different representations, different flavors that were completely incompatible with one another. That of course is also an additional user experience nightmare. And so like as a project, you're kind of in this like rock and a hard place. So you either like lock yourself into one option, and you work with only one of the like messaging bridge protocols like Layer 0 or something like that, lock yourself into that model forever because you don't want to have to like deal with multiple different flavors of your tokens, or you have to go and build a lot of liquidity, or you just bite the bullet and say, okay, you know what, our token is not going to be able to be transferable easily across chains. We're going to just never have it really exist on L2s. And at least from our perspective, we think that all of those options don't really make sense. Like people need to have tokens on multiple different chains. This is like a very quintessential part of what DeFi needs in order to operate. And as we move towards more chains, this problem just gets more and more hairy. xERC20 is technically the only solution to this problem, at least as far as we can tell. And the solution is not too complex. It basically does three things. One, the first thing that xERC20 does is it observes that right now in the current model, regardless of whether you're bridging from Ethereum to Optimism using the Optimism canonical bridge, or you work with like multi-chain or layer 0 or Axlar or Chainlink or whatever to like bridge your token through them, in either of those cases, it isn't Rocket Pool that owns the token implementation on Optimism. It's the bridge. The canonical bridge or one of these third-party bridges is the one that actually mints the representation of like our ETH and fully owns that contract. And so if something goes wrong, I mean, of course, in the canonical bridge case, something going wrong means like the whole rollup, there's something going wrong with the whole rollup. So in that case, you're probably okay. But with the third-party bridge, if something goes wrong, there's really nothing you can do. There's no way to actually switch off from that approach. And then the flip side of that is that you as a token issuer, as a DAO, and really this applies to really any token issuers, you don't have the flexibility to decide, okay, well, where you don't really own the actual token itself and have the flexibility to decide, okay, like which bridge am I even working with in the first place? So that's kind of the first problem. Is like the first thing that the xERC20 does is it says token issuers should be sovereign. Tokens should not be owned by bridges at all. They should be owned by the token issuers themselves, because fundamentally that's the whole point of the token issuing protocol. Your protocol should have the capacity to mint the tokens, or your DAO should have the capacity to mint the tokens and should ultimately be the decider of who can mint them. Two, you as a token issuer should be able to decide which bridges mint the token. And if you want, you should allow multiple bridges to mint the token. So you should be able to come up with a solution where you say, okay, I don't necessarily want to go and have to build a lot of liquidity for our ETH across chains. Instead, I do want to make it so that the Optimism bridge can mint our ETH, but I also want to allow Connext or Hop or like a couple of other bridges that I feel comfortable with the security model of also to be allowed to mint the token. And that of course brings us to point 3, which is really the kind of sticking point, which is if you allow multiple bridges to mint the same token, then there is naturally a security concern where it's like, well, what happens if one of the bridges gets compromised? Now, you're kind of aggregating the security risk of all of these bridges. And so the third thing that the xERC20 approach does is it allows you as a token issuer to implement rate limits. So you can basically limit the rate at which any given bridge that you decide to support actually mints and burns your tokens. And that's enforced within the token contract itself. And so even in the worst case of a compromise, you have a maximum amount of economic risk that you're taking when working with a bridge at all times. And this actually matters in, for example, the case like multi-chain, where like with the multi-chain hack or rug, or honestly, I actually don't really know what it ended up being. But in a case like that, there was two really bad things that happened to a lot of the projects that were working with multi-chain. We actually, a lot of them have now worked with Connext. Because they just realized how big of an issue this was and ended up realizing the need for the xERC20 approach. The two big things that they realized were, one, having multi-chain be the only minter and burner of their token meant that they had effectively like unbounded risk. So all of the funds that were in multi-chain that were minted across chains were lost. There was no way for them to limit that risk from multi-chain's perspective. And it's somewhat, so it doesn't seem as though like all of multi-chain was compromised, but if it was, then I think the outcome for these projects would have been way, way worse. And I think many of them realized that. And then two, and this is kind of the secondary sticking point, is like, even after the hack, all of these projects went through an extremely complicated process to be able to then unentangle themselves from the multi-chain system and then restart their token. Because the only way to do that, because the token had been minted by multi-chain on each chain, the only way for them to actually unentangle was to go and fully redeploy their token implementations on each chain, migrate all of their users to the new implementation, and wind down all of the old multi-chain liquidity. So, remove that from liquidity pools, like restart all of the DEX pools that they had, et cetera. Like it's a huge mess. That is the specific outcome that we are trying to avoid token issuers having to get into. It shouldn't ever be the case that you have to like fully unwind liquidity positions for any token that is actively being used. That would never, especially for something like a liquid staking token, that would just be a nightmare scenario. So yeah, I'll pause there. I know that was a lot of info, so we can jump into like any aspect of that, and happy to expand on it more.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think you did an excellent job kind of explaining a complex topic, but in a very straightforward way. And let me just see if I'm tracking here. I understand that the xERC20 product you have, it's a way to move, I suppose, ERC20 tokens, right? It's not allowing a way to wormhole or teleport through to the layer one to actually interact with a contract. You're just moving the tokens cross chain. Is that correct, or am I misunderstanding?
You can interact with contracts if you want as well. This is basically just a primitive. So I guess there's two things there. One is it's not a product. It is a standard. So this is actually an EIP. It's EIP 7281.
Okay.
It is totally bridge agnostic. It has actually, honestly, it doesn't really, it isn't directly tied to Connext in any way whatsoever, and doesn't disproportionately benefit us, except insofar as it just creates a more even playing field for competition, which I think benefits everybody, or at least benefits like everybody that's not benefiting from a monopoly. And then two, in this case, this is sort of a primitive. So like on top of, it's like you can use this to mint and burn a token across chains, but there's no reason why then that couldn't be coupled with Connext's existing mechanisms or any protocol's existing mechanisms to then do something with that token. So you could do things like, allow people to stake allow people to stake ETH from L2 and then receive our ETH on L2, and like they're actually staking on the L1 Rocket Pool contracts, but all of that is happening in a single transaction. They don't ever need to know that that's happening.
Oh, interesting. So then, now let me ask kind of a forward-looking question here. I mean, obviously with Rocket Pool, we have the RETH token, and I believe it's been ported to a number of the major, like Optimism, Arbitrum, perhaps a couple other ones there that are coming to my mind right now. And so what would be your recommendation? I mean, is this something that our PDAO would get involved with in terms of using Connext to adopt the EIP 7281 standard and transition our tokens over or incorporate them with them? Like, what would you recommend as kind of the next step in evaluating a solution based on this EIP for our ETH token?
Yeah. So I think, it would look something like that. So, basically we're sort of seeking buy-in on two different things here. The first is the xERC20 approach more generally, and it is fully possible to use that approach without Connext. There's at least one project that is doing that currently. I'm sure there will be others eventually. And then separately from that, then, obviously buying into Connext, which we would we have good reasons for why to do that as well. But at this stage, what we're really interested in is just like the former. And that's something that we're super down to help with, because we understand it's like a more complex thing. How does that work mechanically? So this is something that is actually kind of part of the open conversation that I'm very interested in having with y'all, because there's a few different ways to make it work. Of course, it's always easiest if like the token is only on one chain, or if it's not deployed at all, because then you could just deploy it out of the gate as an xERC20. You don't have to worry about any of this at all. When you do have an already deployed system with an existing representation, you do have to basically work towards migrating to the standard. The good thing is that this is a definitively like a one-time migration. Once you have this migration done, now you own the token implementation on each chain. You can then choose whatever you want to do with it, and in perpetuity, you then possess the capacity. Like the Rocket Pool DAO would then possess the capacity to say, they either you want to lock into certain things forever, or you want to maintain optionality and decide how to update your preferences over time. But that migration step largely would look, and we've done this with Alchemix very recently, for instance. That migration step largely looks like going and deploying the new xERC20 flavor, signaling to people on each of these chains, like DeFi protocols, et cetera, that there needs to be a migration that happens to new thing. So you'd have to basically migrate on UIs and things like that. And then after that, working to deprecate the legacy token. The nice thing is with the approach that we have, deprecating legacy tokens is actually somewhat easier because you can use your own like treasury funds to do that rather than needing users to actually like go and bridge tokens back, because we found that is usually the like most high friction point of contact. But yeah, I can step through a little bit more of how that works if you think that's useful. It might be a little bit more abstract and technical.
Yeah, it probably is. I was saying, like, I mean, I suppose the interesting thing is, and this is, one of the problems that you highlight is that as the number of L2s grow, right, folks want to hold their RETH on whatever L2 they're on, right, and they
Yep.
they don't want to have to get it from various different sources. If they see a good trade or contract, they want to, let's say there's something really cool on base and they want to go interact with that with their RETH, but their RETH is over on Arbitrum.
Yep.
It's very difficult to do cross-chain interoperability, right? You got to find a bridge, you got to move the bridge over. If there's a time delay, you got to wait for the time delay, and then you do it. So it becomes kind of an ordeal, right? And I think what you're trying to do,
absolutely,
chain abstraction, is to just be able to do whatever you want to do on whatever chain you want, and you can hold your tokens and wherever you have them, right? And so I
exactly
a strong advantage to having RE start to look at something like that. I think our initial amount of interchain operability is just using the the canonical bridges and a few other. I think Hop Protocol had created a number of bridges for our tokens, but it does seem like this is something that maybe should be brought up to the DAO, the Rocket Pool DAO, and perhaps, I'm not sure if you're aware of the grants opportunities that come up just about every month, that it might be really good to propose an assessment to look at this and try to explain what advantages it would give, what competitive advantages or user advantages it would give RETH, and at the same time try to create some context about a methodology or a risk assessment about what type of risk would we be exposed to, and what would it actually take to get some organization to the various RETH tokens on the various chains and so forth. So I would encourage you to, if you're not familiar with it, to maybe consider a grant, an application, or to start engaging the community about this. There's a number of smart individuals in there that could probably weigh the pros and cons much better than I can.
That would be awesome. Actually, that is something that, so I mean, we're obviously at a high level familiar with the process of working with DAOs, just because we have our own DAO as well. But I don't know the ins and outs of the Rocket Pool DAO. I think perhaps Max may have some more context on this. I don't know if he's on this Twitter space, but regardless, I do think this does definitely sound something like that we would be interested in, especially like the grant side, because we have teams that we work with in our ecosystem that are kind of core contributors to the protocol. So one thing to kind of state here is that Connext itself is surprisingly decentralized ecosystem made up of many different contributing teams. And that's something that it's more of a collective, and that's something that we felt very strongly about for quite a while. And I think that has the benefit of being able to like let us, work with these kinds of this kind of a structure very well, where like it's easier for like one of the core contributors to Connext to just, be the entity that is representing this approach and this standard in a more open capacity, and then go and apply for a grant and like be the actual execution team that goes and builds it. Even if it's not necessarily like the DAO itself that's doing it, which is kind of cool. I guess my question to you would be, how is your grants program structured? I assume you guys have cycles. And then two, who are some of the best people for us to like chat with more directly to start getting feedback on that?
Two excellent questions. On the first one, I'm very pleased to say that the grants management that I serve as a member on has made improvements that now the grants open up, I want to say almost monthly. It's I think about a 6-week.
Oh, it's awesome.
6-week cycle in there. So I would say just you could almost start in applying at any time. And the first thing I always recommend with folks is to solicit input through the Discord. We've got a very active Discord community in there. And I would start out perhaps proposing something. I don't know the best channel. Maybe Patches has a good suggestion here, but perhaps the governance channel or something like that. They can create a thread. But there's numerous very devoted leaders and community members that are probably more knowledgeable about this than I am, that would start engaging with you in that conversation, or any other grant applicant on kind of the grant, and kind of work it up a little bit. And then from there, there's a process in which you then propose in the forum when the calls come out. And basically it's a rolling grant opportunity. So there's always a call open pretty much at all times.
Amazing. Okay. Yeah, I think that would be really, really fantastic.
Yeah, and it's I mean, it sounds, it's kind of interesting, a little different aspect than other ones, but it does seem that, ultimately, if you look at what is the purpose of Rocket Pool, it's to produce a liquid stake token, RETH, right? I mean, certainly as decentralized and open source and permissionless nodes and so forth, but at the end of the day, it produces a product, and the more value we can add to holders of RETH, that product, and if cross-chain interoperability is one of the desired attributes that they want, I think it could be worth exploring. But
Absolutely.
As we kind of reach the end of this part of the segment here, are there any other things that you haven't talked about in regards to Connext that you feel important for our community to know about the protocol?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall, I would say, there's a couple of things that really differentiates Connext from a lot of the other approaches that are out there. We haven't been as aggressive on like marketing and BD as a lot of the other projects that are out there, but a big part of the reason for that is that our focus has always been around like finding a way to build very like open public goods. I think the xERC20 approach is like probably the quintessential example of that, where this is a standard that really fundamentally just tries to push forward bridging in a way where, it fixes everybody's liquidity problems. It really massively creates like a stepwise improvement to security. And it does so in a way that doesn't really disproportionately benefit any project. However, we do think that like one of the nice things that comes out of that is that it does like create incentives for projects like, Rocket Pool, for DAOs really to like think more deeply about the security of bridges. And we think that this is a topic that is really worthwhile to double click on for the space more broadly. For us, as I mentioned earlier, like our philosophy has always been that this space really, I mean, we can find ways to kind of hack through decentralization and try to find ways to make this stuff like usable as fast as possible. And I think that that's important to do, at least to an extent. But I do think that there's, especially before we try to hit mass adoption, we do need to try to figure out how to make some like critical pieces of infrastructure like bridging actually secure. Bridging has been such a nightmare for everybody in this space for the past few years. And like, we think a big part of the reason behind that is just that a lot of the work that's been done around it has been basically taking shortcuts to try to find ways to just go to market as quickly as possible, rather than trying to build on top of some of the actual infrastructure that exists today. And from our perspective, we have like the Connext philosophy has always been that there is really battle-hardened infrastructure that is already the underpinning security behind things like rollups, right? Like the Optimism bridge, the Arbitrum bridge, the Polygon bridge, and like the rollups that are being built on top of them, they are, as well as all the other rollups that are out there, those things have been really, really aggressively tested at this point. There's, the likelihood of there being, bugs that are at least like the likelihood of there being critical vulnerabilities in them decreases as time goes on. And so from our perspective, it's beneficial for the space to rely on that infrastructure as much as possible. And that is really what is that underpins Connext's whole security model and philosophy. And so, yeah, I would say, I guess is just a kind of final point there. For us, we really, really believe in this xERC20 approach, especially for liquid staking tokens, because they're just such an important primitive, especially something like RETH. Because RETH has to be everywhere. It just does. I mean, even a long tail video game rollup that gets created will potentially use RETH at some point, just because it's just an easy source of yield. And in that world, you not only need like amazing liquidity of RETH, but you also need to make sure that RETH is as secure as possible across all of the chains, because otherwise, there's just this like compounding risk that Rocket Pool faces, that your product faces. And we think that like the solution to that is to work together on this approach.
Well, excellent, Arjun. It's been a pleasure speaking to you and having you explain a little bit about the Connext network. And I, for one, learned quite a bit in the call, and I very much encourage you to continue the conversation in the Discord channels and engage with the community. It sounds like there might be a partnership opportunity here.